note that I've then formally tendered a statement of Leanne Little. I should have done that earlier. That will form part of our brief at 10-10C, which is the section where other expert statements exist.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Mr. McMahon.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Ms. Earle, my name is McMahon and I act for the Paramburu Community End which I'm sure you know is a group focused on justice for Indamu, and in a broader sense for the purpose of this inquest, focused on broader issues, many which you've addressed in your statement. I won't be rehearsing what's already been done in court, but if I can take you, you have your statement in front of you?
I do.
Could I take you to page 5, paragraph 16? Dr. Dwyer briefly took you there, but she had many things to cover, and I'm not going to cover many things with you. At the top of page 5, in considering the intervention and the consequences of the intervention, you note that since intervention, incarceration rates in the Northern Territory have doubled for Aboriginal men, tripled for Aboriginal women, and that suicide rates have increased in the area of 6-fold. So those are obviously catastrophically bad statistics. Okay. I suggest that really that the data that you're revealing there is a brutal insight into what's happened with the interaction of the Aboriginal community and the justice system since the intervention.
Yes.
Yeah. Because the data is the message. Do you agree that it shows persistent failure? I might be wrong, I'm just putting this to you, that when we look at the graphs of the data that you suggested, the shocking increases in those numbers, whatever anybody says about what they're doing, what it in fact reveals is a persistent failure in understanding by government, policymakers, the justice system as a whole, in addressing those issues which lead to more jailing.
I think the statistics alone show a picture, but when you combine them with other evidence from Coronial inquests and you combine them with testimony of Aboriginal people who would capture that content for the Justice Agreement, they paint a picture rather than just the statistics of what we need to actually tackle. So whilst the intervention is one area responsible for it, it's not the only issue that was responsible.
Absolutely. So it's not the only cause, but it's really the time frame, I think. The intervention is a convenient hook to give a time frame. And in your statement, that paragraph, you say, well, from this time frame, these statistics reveal a shocking deterioration in the welfare of the Aboriginal people of the Northern Territory when viewed through the prism of the justice system and that data.
That's correct. The data is very clear that the incarceration rate has doubled, tripled for women, and that Aboriginal suicide rates, especially for youth, have increased 6-fold.
And would you agree that, insofar as I've already put that data reveals a persistent failure to have sufficient insight into the causes of the problems leading to more jailing, would you agree that there seems to be an absence, pardon me, I'll rephrase that, would you agree that the data suggests an absence of evidence-based reform? To put that another way, if the reforms were more evidence-based, according to many of the matters that you've already raised in your statement, we'd expect the data not to be showing such rapid deterioration, but at least some improvement.
That's right, but for what we recognised and what our experts told us when we were capturing the content that's outlined in the Pathways document, data alone only presents one part of the story.
Undoubtedly. you refer many times, so I won't take you to particular places, but you refer many times in your statement to the super shires, as you call them, and would you agree that a fair summary of the way you've analysed and discussed the super shires is that it's a fairly damning analysis by you as to the effect that they've had on remote communities?
Yeah, people told us that the shires disengaged any relationship with Aboriginal people in the community. They had no control, and it disenfranchised them from any accountability or responsibility for anything within their communities.
So you agree that if policymakers and government were listening to the community, that they would see that there was a need to rethink the super shires and how they worked vis-a-vis the remote communities?
Yes, that was definitely the messaging we got from the consults.
And part of the message you got was that a consequence of the creation of the super shires is that critical matters such as decision making, employment powers, having control over quality of life matters such as broken windows, broken toilets, and those small but essential matters to quality of life. The community is saying that those things need to be, and I'm of course talking about the Yunamu community, but you're talking about many communities, those communities that are saying that those matters need to be returned to the local level of decision making.
That's right. And if I can give you one example that was told to me on the consults, a lot of the communities once had football ovals that were watered because the community council watered and paid for the water bill. When the shires took over, a lot of the shires did not pay for the water bill. That meant that their football and netball and basketball or any sporting activity that was in that community was no longer occurring. Those football matches weren't just about playing football. They were where disputes got negotiated, conciliated, collaborated, where families discussed issues around child protection and kinship care and more. So that type of information and knowledge of the impact of something as simple as not paying the water bill to make the grass grow on an oval in a community feeds down into a system that has far more significant consequences than a decision that's made whether you pay the water bill or not.
And it's precisely the sort of deep insight which would be obvious to a locally controlled community.
Exactly. And that was exactly what community said was missing. Those decisions were dismissed by other people who held the decision power, and community had no way of feeding into that process.
And in fact, going far beyond the Aboriginal community, you may be aware that in the drought in Eastern Australia in the first decade of this century, many towns which were almost starved of water nevertheless would water the football oval and the sporting facilities so that the community could meet and have a living community despite the hardship of the horrific drought.
That's right.
There's, can I take you to paragraph 230 of your statement? I may just have misunderstood. You've already been asked a bit about this. I just may have misunderstood, and I just want to give you an opportunity to clarify for the benefit of us. You say there that at paragraph 230 that you've been advised that the Law and Justice groups will be delivered by the Department of the Chief Minister's Office, and it's unclear what the AJU's role is in delivering that. And then I think in answer to some questions perhaps from our honour, there was a distinction between an AJU having a role in the cultural aspect of it and then some other entity, and I wasn't sure what you said there, having a role in the operational rollout.
No, so the Chief Minister's Office will deliver the operational component, and the AJU, I've been told, will deliver the policy position.
Perhaps one impression that what one gets from reading your statement, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there seems to be a great deal of work done to a certain point, and then it's almost like there's some kind of roadblock which isn't spelled out there. There seems to be a momentum which you've described and a lot of work done to get these local law and justice groups up and running, and yet what one would expect to read further in your statement, which isn't there, is that, and now look at them, here, there and everywhere. And now, can you just, am I getting that wrong, or is there something that needs to be elaborated there to show that we've reached some kind of jam or roadblock which delays the implementation of all the work that you've done over a number of years in this area?
So there's a lot of work going behind the scenes with the Justice Agreement, and our most fast-paced position is the delivery of the alternatives to custody, which
Can you
is...
say that sentence again, please?
So a lot of the work, while it looks like that we've put the handbrake on the law and justice groups, we're only a very small team that's delivering and working with these communities. So a lot of energy is being put into the alternatives to custody that we're driving and will deliver on soon, because we've had so much success with the facility that we have here in Alice Springs with Aboriginal women. And we're working with the Land Council on Grid Island to deliver another one there. They take up a considerable amount of our time to deliver on those. There's a lot of work going on, but it hasn't been outlined in my statement. That's what I have to...
No, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure we understood
Yes.
the point that you're making there.
And as an aside, where are you up to with the alternatives to custody on Grid Island?
So a lot of work has been put in place. We have the Law and Justice Group there, and obviously any Law and Justice Group will get a community court, and we will be... That facility for Aboriginal men aged 18 to 25 will be operational mid this year.
Can I take you to page 84 of your statement?
And more specifically,
sorry.
sorry to interrupt, more specifically for the purposes of this inquest, is it available for, as an alternative to custody for that age group across the territory, or is it top end only, or is there still decisions being made in that area?
So there's still decisions being made through the Law and Justice Group as to the criteria for eligibility into that facility. It's at this stage the age criteria has been extended to include younger people. There is sufficient numbers in the Grid Island community to ensure that that facility gets is at capacity when we roll it out in July.
If I can take you to page 84 of your statement, please.
Page 84, paragraph.
Page 84. So this is a long paragraph where you talk about recommendations to the coroner that would prevent future deaths. And as you appreciate, I'm sure, one of our purposes here, the Parent Group Committee, is to point out that many of the surrounding circumstances in the community and in the history of the community are relevant to how the shooting came about. Now, at the top of page 84, in the second dot point, you mention an Aboriginal Justice Commission, which you developed earlier, and I won't take you there, but you talk about what we might say is the weakness in the system, where there are allegations of police misconduct against Aboriginal people being investigated by police. Now, we'll be submitting later to Her Honour that the evidence that we've heard in this inquest reveals that there are substantial failings in the process of police investigating police, and a really quite radical change is needed to deal with the issue of assessing allegations of police violence against Aboriginal people. And is that something you would like to comment on in light of the dot point that you've made there? When I say like, is that something you're able to comment on in terms of your work? It seems from reading your long statement that you've had a lot of interaction and work with the police at various levels at various times. and told you what our submissions are going to be to Her Honour. Is that something you're able to assist with?
As part of our research and part of the consultation, it was very clear that Aboriginal people felt that it was inappropriate for police to investigate allegations that Aboriginal people had laid without appropriate training and knowledge of how Aboriginal people felt and the recognition of racism in all its forms in systems, particularly systemic racism in structures from police, health, education, you name it. People felt they weren't getting a fair, transparent process if police were investigating police.
Now, that's the information that you've gathered over
3 years.
not only 3 years, I suspect, but really
3 decades.
Given your CV and kind of work you've done, you would have heard a lot about that over your life. But in particular, you've had a very focused 3 years in dealing with so many Aboriginal communities, and that's a message that you've heard. Do you have? It's appropriate, I think, to ask you to explain, if you can, what solutions you see to that. What we've seen in this court, which you probably might have seen a little bit of in the media, are numerous videos of unacceptable violence and so on. And we've heard quite a bit of evidence recently about how that's dealt with, and we will be submitting that the evidence reveals that it's been dealt with unsatisfactorily. How do you see, what sort of solutions do you see for that? In terms of how to manage that problem, bearing in mind that the government has said in numerous key documents which we're aware of in this inquest, including the Aboriginal Justice Agreement and its second objective, to listen to the community.
I think unless you have an Aboriginal person inside the complaint system that can articulate the impact and the pain and suffering or the feelings of Aboriginal people to that complaint and their voice is heard, then you are missing the ability for Aboriginal people, when they lodge complaints, to fully feel that they've been listened to and that the matter's been satisfactorily resolved.
So there's a generalisation, and I know it's not always true, there's a generalisation that seems clear to an outsider such as myself, which is what I am, that NARJA are often involved in assisting Aboriginal people to put forward the complaint, and so at that level the connection to community is obviously strong. But at the next level, you would urge, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you would urge, I suggest, that there be a strong Aboriginal presence in the review process and the consideration of the allegation.
Correct, and that's why I suggest that the Aboriginal Justice Commission perform that role, because understanding the impact on Aboriginal people as a result of those allegations is important, given the power and privilege that a lot of the systems have that interact with Aboriginal people.
And can I suggest that, from what you said, you would agree that regardless of whether or not the Aboriginal Justice Commission had a role, because whatever recommendations Her Honour makes, some may and some may not be implemented, but regardless of that, you would agree that if there were to be a much greater involvement of Aboriginal people in the review process, that should certainly not be confined to people who are Aboriginal police officers. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
And it could involve people who were, for instance, Aboriginal lawyers or experts in Aboriginal workers in social welfare or other areas of leadership within the Aboriginal community.
Correct. That would be the intention of how whatever process through the Aboriginal Justice Commission, how that will fall out and play out. That, you know, but complaints would be part of that process so that they were independently assessed, or there was advice provided to any current process that feeds into complaint systems.
Thank you. Other questions? Don't be shy. Sorry, your name again is?
Hearn.
Hearn. Thanks, Mr. Hearn.
My name is Hearn, and I am the solicitor representing the Walker, Lane and Robertson families. And with the benefit of the questions that my friends have asked, I've just got one area of questions to ask you. We've heard a lot of evidence in this inquest about the reforms that the Northern Territory Police Force have either in development or early implementation phase. They've been described at one point in the material as a wholesale review of all policies, procedures, general orders, standard operating procedures and instructions. Accepting that the resulting changes to policy is going to have wide-ranging effects for Aboriginal people who interact with police and the communities in which they live and the relationship that those communities have with the police. Do you have any view as to what an ideal model for consultation would look like when we're talking about the development of policy and reforms on this scale?
At its bare minimum, you would want Aboriginal people involved.
At what stage? And what
At every stage. If it impacts on Aboriginal people and it causes and those reforms, given the statistics that we have in the justice system and the level of interaction that these reforms and so forth have with police, you would expect Aboriginal people to be engaged in every part of that process.
Including in the prioritisation of the areas in which reform is to be directed and addressed?
Are you referring to the list of reforms that I've seen in the statement?
Yes.
So there's significant reforms, and from what I understand, there's a lot of areas that still need attention in that. The process of consultation to do that, I think, has been outlined in previous recommendations from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody to just knowing how to relate and conduct consultations with Aboriginal people well.
Do you see that the process of consultation in this process of reform has followed those recommendations?
I haven't been contacted or involved in those processes except for the Galliot paper review issue.
Do you know how the Northern Territory Police Force is informing itself as to matters that affect the Aboriginal community in the development of their new policies?
No, I do not.
In the position that you hold and with your experience, would that be something that you would expect to be aware of?
I think that would be one of the first places you would come to, was to speak to us, given our most comprehensive consultation process, but also for us to give other agencies advice on how to consult appropriately.
And has that, I take it that contact has not been forthcoming?
Only in the Galliot paper.
In your role as the Director of the Aboriginal Justice Unit, you would be able to facilitate that engagement and consultation for the benefit of the Northern Territory Police Force and the development of its policy going forward?
We would be happy to cooperate with the Northern Territory Police Force in that process. There would be some conditions around the employment of cultural brokers, interpreters, and how we would work with Aboriginal communities in that process that we'd need to agree on.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I do, Your Honour.
Sorry.
So I'm sure Dr. Freckleton had any questions.
Mr. Zishivanowski.
Ms Little, my name is Zishivanowski. I act for MT Hub.
Hello.
You said there were 2 rounds of consultation for the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, is that correct? What was the purpose of the first round of consultation?
The first round was to capture the content, and then we had that was the first lot of communities that we consulted with, and then we moved into the second phase. But the first phase dealt with the content for the draft agreement, which then allowed for the submissions to feed into that process, and then we completed with the second round.
And over what period of time did that first round of consultations take place?
I couldn't tell you exactly, but it would be over a year and a bit.
Was UNDMU consulted at all in the first round of consultations?
Not in the first round, no.
I might just take you to the document 20-5 on the brief, Pathways to Community Control.
What paragraph?
It's not in your statement.
Oh, the pathways.
Yeah.
Yes,
You've got a copy there?
I've got a copy.
Page 17 is an appendix.
17. Yes.
List of consultations for the draft Northern Territory Aboriginal Justice Agreement. And then over the following page, about 8 or so from the bottom, it seems to record a consultation in UNDMU on the 16th of August 2018.
You must be looking at a different document. The pathways is the 1.7?
Beck, the version on your screen, can we go to page 7?
Oh no, that's an appendix.
Yes. Oh, sorry, my mistake, 117. Page 117.
Oh, was that? Oh, okay. Yes, I can see that.
Of the pathways document.
Of the pathways.
Yes, got that.
Sorry. So that's the appendix.
Mhm.
And then over the following page, about 10 or so from the bottom.
Yes.
Upper Tanami, UNDMU, 16th of August 2018.
Mhm.
Would that have been a consultation in the first round or the second?
The second.
And was there a registrar of the consultations that occurred in that second round?
Yes, there is.
And that registrar is not covered in the conference.
No, that one's not, I believe.
And the purpose of the second round of consultations was to refine the draft Aboriginal Justice Agreement?
To continue some of the communities who wanted us back, but also to go visit communities we hadn't visited before. But it was just a continuation of what we had captured in workshops that we had held with government and so forth, just following and feeding into the content for a final agreement.
In your statement, you also refer to a consultation you went to in 2020.
2020.
Would that also have been part of the second round?
2020.
Take you to it.
No, I think the agreement was written by then. We had gone back into communities to close the loop, to tell communities what we had developed and what we did with their information.
Okay, so what was the purpose of that? Was that a third round of consultation?
No, that was information to advise community what we had done and what we had done with their content and where it had landed in a final agreement.
So less a consultation and more of a reporting.
Closing the loop on what we had done with with their information and content.
And how it informed the development of the...
Correct.
Thank you, Mr.
Dr. Freckleton?
Thank you, Your Honour. So, my name is Ian Freckleton. I'm appearing from Northern Territory Police.
Hi, how are you?
I take it from something you've said already that you've had an opportunity to read or at least review briefly the statement of Deputy Commissioner Smallpage made this year.
Yes, I've read some of that information.
Employment of Aboriginal people throughout the public service is not as high as you and many others would want so far, is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Nonetheless, you will have seen from the statement of the Deputy Commissioner that some 279 people, 11.4% of the workforce of the Northern Territory Police and Emergency Services personnel are Aboriginal. Paragraph 100, John.
Which affidavit?
Third one.
Just need to correct the record. I don't believe that the witness has seen any of those statements. All she's seen is MS12, which is the summary of the alleged reforms.
Oh, okay.
So she has.
That's all right. That's not what she said, but that's
Yeah.
absolutely fine. That's all right. Let me tell you what's in there if you haven't had a chance to see it. So let's go back to what I was saying to you. There are 279 or so Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders who are employed by the Northern Territory Police, Fire and Emergency Services, namely 11.4% of the workforce. How does that compare to other parts of the public service, do you know?
No, I wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head, no.
The understanding of the Deputy Commissioner is that is not exceeded anywhere else in the public service. You can't say anything about that?
Oh, well, what I would have to say is that given the interaction of the number of Aboriginal people engaged in the justice system, one would anticipate even a higher level of engagement and employment of Aboriginal people, given that the interaction is so high. And I would also say that given the interaction of Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory Police Force, I would expect that spread of that 11.4% to be across all ranks and seniority positions within the police force to reflect and congratulate the police force on that number.
You would accept, presumably, though, that reaching those kinds of aspirational targets is something that inevitably is going to take some time?
No, I don't think so. I think that is where the issue of systems and systemic racism tackles issues that address the low level of Aboriginal people when we're so embedded in the justice system. I believe that change in those systems will improve Aboriginal employment and retention rates of Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory Police Force.
At this stage, perhaps unsurprisingly, the majority of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sworn police officers are constables. There's some 91 of those. It's going to take a little while, you'd know this based on your own experience in the South Australian Force, for those persons to make their way up through the ranks to become superintendents and assistant commissioners and so on, isn't it?
I think the police force has been around a long time, and for me, even when I was in the South Australian Police Force, there were opportunities available to me to get up in the ranks. I go back to the issue that given the amount of interaction and the number of Aboriginal people that would be willing to join the police force, I would have expected at least there to be Aboriginal commissioned officers or several commissioned officers who are Aboriginal in the Northern Territory Police Force.
What rank did you reach yourself?
A senior constable.
Right, and you were in the South Australian Police Force for how long?
10 years.
Right. Okay. It takes time to go up through the ranks in any police force, doesn't it? But what you're looking for is opportunities to perhaps expedite promotion for those who have the necessary skills and aptitudes.
Well, I think there's two things at play here. One is the attractiveness of the police force as a place where Aboriginal people want to work. So I go back to systems and the ability to change systems to make them attractive for Aboriginal people to be employed in the police force. So it does take time, but ever since I've been a child growing up here in the Northern Territory, and I'm now in my late 50s, well, early
That's a bit
50s.
harsh, you're in your early 50s.
I'm in
is
my
that right?
early 50s.
Yes.
I'm yet to see an Aboriginal commissioned officer that I know
Yes.
of in the Northern Territory Police Force. I think we can do better than that.
Absolutely. There are a number of challenges to persuading members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community to join the police force, though, including the difficulties, I'm using a neutral word, but the many bad experiences that have occurred in the past, and also including the extensive period of training in Darwin that's required for police officers. I'm informed by my client that that's proved to be a logistical impediment so far to encouraging large numbers of Indigenous persons to join the police force. Do you have any comment to make on that?
I think it goes back to what I was asked in the very early piece of my evidence, that understanding Aboriginal people's connection and interaction with police plays a role. But I think I don't see them as challenges if you address them and you acknowledge them and you deal with them and tackle with them. And unfortunately, one of those issues has to be the structures and the systems that create barriers to Aboriginal people joining the police force. And one of those barriers that I personally experienced would have to be, and I can illustrate to you some of the areas are around structural racism in the systems. And the police force is not alone in this, I have to say. This is not a standalone issue for the Northern Territory Police Force.
Thank you, you've been very clear about that. And if consulted by the Northern Territory Police Force, you'd be prepared to work with them to formulate strategies for employing more Indigenous persons?
That would be part of the review process as we deliver the review of every government agency to look at employment, retention, and in getting Aboriginal people up into senior ranks and more.
You've probably heard from the reporting and the information that's been provided to you that the system in the Territory for having Aboriginal liaison officers has only existed for 2 or 3 years now, but that there are some 50 who have been employed, and the hope is to employ a considerable number more. You'd be positive about that strategy, I take it?
Certainly positive, but the decision making occurs in those higher ranks.
Of course.
And I just want to make the point that you can employ lower level employees in a system, but if we're not at the table to make the decisions, to provide the contribution given our interaction and over-representation of Aboriginal people in the justice system, then where is that conversation coming from, and where is that information and knowledge coming from to inform the senior ranks about Aboriginal issues, let alone how Aboriginal people need to be engaged and employed and retained in the Northern Territory Police Force?
Yes. However, you, for instance, have spent 3 distinguished decades in contributing and learning about the system. Even yourself would not have been able to contribute in the way that you can now when you were in your 20s or your early 30s, would you?
I think I could have been a lot higher up in my ranks by the time I left if the system supported me, yes.
So, would you accept this, that a constructive strategy is that which is being deployed by the Northern Territory Police Force to bring in as many ALOs as possible and to facilitate their moving into becoming ACPOs, and after that encouraging them and facilitating their becoming sworn members? In other words, a graded
Look,
process
I think,
to encourage.
I've been around the block a bit in terms of the justice system.
Yes.
I've been around the block in many agencies to see employment strategies, and I get quite annoyed when when people try to attract Aboriginal people at the lower ranks. We have intelligent, smart, capable Aboriginal people that could walk straight into commissioned roles in the police force if the systems support that.
Without having any background in policing at all, you're contemplating persons coming in at superintendent level?
I think there needs to be a mentoring type program, or, I mean, other police forces across the nation have significant Aboriginal people in their commissioned officers' roles. I think there's lessons to be learnt there. I go back and say you can put as much effort as you like into ACPOs, ALOs, and then junior officers, but my knowledge and my history in the police force tells me that the decisions that need to be made that will create a different environment and a different culture in the police force happens in those commissioned ranks.
Absolutely.
And that's where you need the Aboriginal people.
No argument there. But would you accept that there would be some informational and experiential challenges in lateral recruitment of persons from within the territory who've had no experience as a constable, a sergeant, a senior sergeant, etc., up into the commission ranks?
And yes, that's correct, yes.
Let me move to another issue then. You've mooted the idea of an Aboriginal Justice Commission having a role in relation to complaints made by Aboriginal people about the conduct of police officers. You'd be familiar generally with the role already of the Professional Standards Command and also the Ombudsman's Office. Can you say a little more to Her Honour about how you would see the Aboriginal Justice Commission locking into the system which exists at the moment, or do you have in mind a complete reformulation of the process?
Yeah, I think there needs to be complete reformation. I think that there needs to be a system that actually meets the needs of Aboriginal Territorians, and I think we need a system that actually reflects Aboriginal people's issues, and that there's Aboriginal people there assessing some of those complaints and then feeding either what the architecture of that looks like, what the mechanics is. Look, I mean, but all I know at the moment is that the ability for Aboriginal people to feel like they've been heard and be satisfied that their complaints are being dealt with, given their background, given their feelings, hasn't been expressed to us in the consultation process.
Can you see an advantage in serious complaints being rigorously investigated by police officers who have coercive powers and backgrounds as detectives in investigating?
Are you talking about complaints
Serious about, for instance, excessive use of force, where an injury has been sustained?
No, I still think they need to be led by an Aboriginal entity of some sort, and external to the police, and the police can feed into that process,
Right.
which is a complete redesign of the model that's currently in place.
Are you aware of that kind of model having been implemented anywhere else in the world?
I know that that's been the recommendations from Royal Commissions and more that have never been implemented.
So you're not aware of anywhere else where that kind of a model has been implemented yet?
Not that I'm aware of, but I haven't researched that area.
At any rate, as you know, the Galliot report is now being reflected upon internally within the police force, and there's going to be an extensive period of consultation. You'd be prepared to participate in that and share your perspectives and your insights?
Absolutely. I do know that report did not deal with systemic racism, which was, I think, a missed opportunity or a misinterpreted opportunity. I'm not sure which it was, but at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of areas of reform that need to be added to that list that I've seen that need not to tackle issues like cultural awareness programs and cultural competency, given the evidence and best practice that says that they have little impact on changing people's behaviours.
And that's one of the
and
inputs
attitudes.
that you'd be prepared to make to the reform process?
The AJU would be more than willing, given the expertise in our team, to tackle that, but it would not be anything around cultural awareness programs.
Thank you very much for answering these questions.
Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you. There's a number of definitions floating around about what constitutes systemic racism. Mr. Mullins took you to the Herriot definition, and we don't cavil with that at all. But would the UK definition assist police understand systemic racism more clearly? In particular, the second part of the definition, which appears in paragraph 299 of your statement, and I'll read it out, because there's a lot of people that don't appear to be able to see it. And this definition, which is used by UK police, says it can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racial stereotyping. Now my question to you is, do you think that gives a better framework for police, particularly non-Aboriginal police, to understand false assumptions, thoughtlessness, and how that might be systemic racism?
Yes, I think that is probably the best definition that's relevant to any police force that I've seen.
Thank you. Now, I want to then take you to, I think Mr. Hearn raised the issue of the reforms or changes to policing in the Northern Territory, which I understand is summarised in MS12. Can the witness see a copy of MS12, please? Right. Now, you've had a chance to look at that document, haven't you?
Briefly, yes.
Now, you told Mr. Hearn that neither you nor your team were engaged by the Northern Territory Police in any of these changes. Is that right? I withdraw that. Other than having input into Mr. Giglio's report.
Galliot.
Go.
Yes, which is, if it moves further up, then I can see that. Is that it? No, I thought there was more.
There's 7 pages, but...
Yeah, so the Galliot report is the only issue that I can recall that I've been engaged in.
And I think you told Mr. Hearn words to the effect that either your body or another Aboriginal consultative body should have had some role. And can you explain to Her Honour why it's important for communities to have, Aboriginal communities to have some input in policies and policy change and reviews?
Because when policies are imposed on Aboriginal community, they impact significantly on Aboriginal people, but we've had no input into it. It's difficult for us to understand its application, its alliance with any other decision that's being made, and we should be part of that process because it impacts on us greatly, and we want to be in a we want to participate and partner with government agencies because we can see what happens when that doesn't happen, and we need to be because particularly these areas of reform that are in that list significantly impact on Aboriginal people and our position to make communities safe, to have a good relationship with community and just to thrive in our communities, basically.
Can I ask a question? The Aboriginal law and justice groups, or whatever name they end up having, are they groups that agencies can speak to about policies and changes to policies and development of policies and procedures?
Yeah, that is exactly one of the core roles, so that there's no need then to engage consultants. The people on the law and justice groups would be language speakers. They would be able to navigate around cultural politics and more, and they would be a constant on the ground that would be able to maintain and even manage and evaluate any policies that are being delivered from any government agency. So it could be as simple as we'd like to change the way we recruit people in our agency as a government, and how does the community feel about having Aboriginal people on interview panels to select people working in our communities. That could go to the Law and Justice Group to say the community's position is this, or it's this, but we'd like that.
So given there are 3 groups currently operating, apart from your overriding agency, they are people on the ground, or groups on the ground that could potentially be consulted. I know they're not in Yunamu, but they are in 3 different locations.
That's right, and the AJU could support any agency in putting together a consultation process that would deliver input from Aboriginal community on any policy reform or more.
Thank you, that's helpful. Just very briefly, do the changes that are reflected in that document that you've seen briefly reflect the feedback that you received from Aboriginal communities in your consultation?
No, they don't. Not in the areas that Aboriginal people had identified that they'd like changes within the Northern Territory Police Force.
What might be missing?
The glaring absence of any attention to systemic racism, the glaring reliance on cultural awareness, the recruitment process of people in the Northern Territory Police Force. They are areas of reform that Aboriginal people just are a few of the many that they would want to be involved in, according to the consultations.
And can you tell the coroner how you feel when you see policies rolled out and changes rolled out without consultation to you or your group, or from the evidence that we've heard today, the commentary, any Indigenous or Aboriginal consultative group? How does that make you feel?
I see this long list of policies and reform and change within the Northern Territory Police Force, and I can't see any input from Aboriginal people that feeds into those reforms that will make it work, and yet we're key people in the justice system that will be impacted by the result of these policies driven by Northern Territory Police Force or any other reform that government agencies do. I feel like ACPO, Derek Walker, and the health workers who have been excluded from conversations that impact on us, and we have a level of expertise that could have assisted parties to do a better job.
Thank you. So just with that in mind, I suppose that leads to your paragraph 299 on page 77 towards the end. It seems from the reforms that there is no reference at all to anti-racism policies. And you've quoted from the UK anti-racism policy that's implemented by the UK police, who do acknowledge, and if you read that paragraph carefully, they do acknowledge that systemic racism exists. But I just want to take the last few sentences on page 77, starting with this plan. And by this plan, I want to make it clear that this is an anti-racism plan. The work that flows from it is more than just tackling individuals who damage policing by their overt racism, or just the necessity to recruit more black officers and staff. It's about looking at how policing works and challenging the policies, procedures, operations and cultures in policing where racism, bias and discrimination exists, so we can ensure that there's no longer a debate to be had on policing and institutional racism.
Your Honour, I'd just like to correct factually some of the basis for the question posed, because as Your Honour has heard in the evidence that's been given, CREG, which has Indigenous officers in it, has played a significant role in the 7 pages of reforms which have been identified by our learned friend. And there are multiple components to attempts to change culture, including in respect of racism, within those 7 pages.
That's an internal body, is it?
It is
Yes.
an internal body
So-
that's a commission or command that's been set up.
So
inside
they're
the police.
reporting within the chain of command. My reference was to independent consultative bodies. I don't think there's any need for clarification, but if you would like me to, I'm happy to do it. That's an internal organisation. I haven't been here when that evidence was given. But I think my point was clear that, and I asked the question whether she or any other Indigenous, Aboriginal, independent consultative body, and I acknowledge that Craig was consulted, but they are within an organisation, and I'm not sure what role they play. But I want to just, you would admit that there is no anti-racism policy, and I want to take you.
No, I wouldn't admit that there's no anti-racism policy.
Okay,
That is
can you
just
direct-
that is just
direct me to
utterly factually incorrect, and Her Honour has heard about the multiple efforts that have been made and the various orders that exist in relation to racism and a variety of other obnoxious forms of behaviour. So that's really something which cannot be let pass.
That's shown. Please show Her Honour, direct me and Her Honour to the formal anti-racism policy that takes the form of looking at how policing works, challenging the policies, procedures, operations and cultures in policing where racism, bias and discrimination exists. The policies that you refer to are individual behavioural issues. If you look at the definition, it can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes, behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting, prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racial stereotyping. There is no policy that refers specifically to that nature of systemic racism. If you can point it out to me, I'd like to see it.
I'm not going to be cross-examined by you, Mr. Newhouse.
But
Her Honour, sit down for a minute. Her Honour knows.
I've heard that there is efforts within the Northern Territory Police force to identify racism, to indicate that it is not in any way tolerated within the police service, and efforts to identify and address systemic racism as it exists in policies and procedures. But is there a separate general order, for example, a leading document like that that specifically deals with systemic racism?
No.
Thank you.
Do you think there should be, Miss Little?
I think given the history of the relationship that Aboriginal people have had from colonisation and the history that Aboriginal people have had with police, and then our interaction so heavily embedded in the justice system with police, that would be the first point of call that I would do if I was in the police force tomorrow, to do an anti-racism policy. That would be one of the bare minimum issues that would address, because what people need to understand is that systemic racism isn't something that people deliberately do and consciously do. It sits within the systems and it has unfair outcomes, and they operate quite often independently until there is a crisis or an issue like this Coronial that brings up the issue, and it creates environments that will attract Aboriginal people to the police force. It creates a culture in systems that are attractive and for every employee in that agency. So I think an anti-racism campaign or strategy would be the bare minimum that I would want to see inside systems like the police force.
And that could refer to safe mechanisms of reporting
Complaints.
concerns about overt racism, or if you've identified some form of systemic racism. in policies or procedures.
Correct, and not just complaints, but structures that support behaviours that on the outset individuals don't agree to, but they sit in there and they have to comply with that because the history's left it there or the system has left it unaddressed, but it impacts unfairly on Aboriginal people. It might be something as simple as a recruitment policy for people that doesn't take into account spent convictions for recruitment. It might mean that you need an employment strategy that attracts Aboriginal commissioned officers rather than the ACPO, ALO constable level. It creates an ability for everyone to create a better place for everyone to work with. It enables better consultation and relationships that address issues such as we've been talking about, the need to return to those community policing models.
I want to take that point further, if you're right. Have you heard of the Hollingsworth report?
Yes, I have.
Can you tell the coroner what's in that report?
So as part of the deliverable under the Aboriginal Justice Agreement, we commissioned an anti-racist campaign, which takes a whole of government approach that identifies ways in which agencies, particularly those that impact on the justice system, can tackle racism inside systems and identify some areas of reform that people may not see as having any issue of discriminatory behaviour in it, but the outcome results in an unfair, unequal outcome. That report would have to be one of the best reports I've read on racism, particularly anti-racism and anti-racism campaign.
Do you know if the police have a copy of that report?
The police are on our AJA governance committee, so they would have seen that report, and it's currently sitting within government processes for approval, but it has gone to the governance committee, and we have a member of the Commission Police Force, a Commission Police officer on that committee who would have been sent that report.
Right, and in your review of the table summarising the changes MS12, can you see any evidence that those recommendations have been incorporated into the changes since the death of Kumanjayi?
I can't see it, but I am unaware of what sits behind those policies to be able to give you a definitive answer to say it's not included.
And would you say it was an oversight if it hasn't been included?
As I said before, I think an anti-racism policy would be the bare minimum that I would want to be looking at to reform issues around the police force.
Thank you. Would you agree it's difficult to see systemic racism without data?
Data is one way of validating evidence whether systemic racism or any racism exists in a system.
So when reforms are being undertaken by senior command in the police force, do they have at their fingertips data on use of force by race, for example, or other critical statistics, complaints based on race?
If I can remember when we were asking for that data to inform Professor Hollingsworth's report, I'm unaware, I'm pretty sure that data was not available by distinction into categories of race.
So would you say that without accurate data, it might be difficult for senior management to be alerted to and track systemic racism?
Well, quite often without data, you don't know what you're dealing with. So my position is no data is no defence. So at the end of the day, unless you have an evidence-based approach that feeds into it, an informed process that captures content that either validates or invalidates, supports or doesn't support a position, without that data, it makes it difficult for you to know what's missing out of the picture.
Yeah. And have you had, at the AJA, had difficulty extracting this kind of data?
Yes, we have for our consultants.
What sort of data might you be asking?
It's in my statement there. We've had difficulty capturing any data on police cautions, police bail and the conditions why bail may have been refused, or conditions of the bail. And there's been other examples where we've had specific, we've asked for specific data on the use of the police caution in language, and the difficulty we've had in securing data to identify areas that needed reform.
I'm going to take you now to Mr. Gallio's report. One of the recommendations of Mr. Gallio is an assistant commissioner with sole responsibility for professional standards. Do you have any comment on that recommendation?
It's difficult for me to speak on a recommendation without understanding the whole document and what's inside that document or the policy. And I would need that before I could have a position on that.
Okay. Well, who do you think should be overseeing professional standards?
Well, I think when an incident involves an Aboriginal person who's or an incident as a victim, or it involves any use of force for Aboriginal people, at the very least, there should be some input from whether that be, which we haven't gotten, the Northern Territory Police Force, an Aboriginal commissioned officer, or an independent body that feeds into that process.
Okay. The Deputy Commissioner accepted there are unsatisfactory delays in resolving complaints. Are you aware of those delays?
Yes, I am.
And are you aware that those delays, if they take too long, can mean that officers cannot be effectively disciplined?
Correct.
Is that something that the AJA is looking at, making recommendations?
When we review the Police Administration Act, that no doubt will be an area that we will look at.
Okay. On the 1st of March, the coroner asked a question about community safety meetings at Yuendamu. What did the AJA consultations hear about community safety meetings?
The feedback from the consultations on community safety meetings was that only white people turned up to complain about Aboriginal people. I was present at one of the consultations where I saw a policeman sitting under a rec hall, and I asked what he was there for, and he said the community said they were there to do this community safety meeting, but unfortunately no one turned up from the community to his meeting. They attended ours.
During his evidence, the Deputy Commissioner said it would be extremely difficult to give police a prescriptive manual about induction into an Aboriginal community. Isn't that the role of the LJG?
Yes, and it's also the role of the ACPOs or ALOs to feed into that process, because the generalisation of and the cultural rules and history of individual communities needs to be distinguished against a whole Northern Territory process.
Now, one of your interests at the AJA is on bail reform, is that correct?
Correct.
The coroner's heard that Kumanjayi Walker called Kapu and said he wanted to return, and Kapu said they couldn't take him back. This is in evidence. What changes would the AJA recommend to decriminalise a breach in circumstances where there's a funeral or cultural practice that's required and an expression of remorse?
I think it was reasonably foreseeable that Kumanjayi Walker would want to have gone to his family's funeral. If there was in place at the time an ability for senior police to make amendments and conditions for Kumanjayi Walker to attend that funeral, I'm not sure we would be here today.
It wasn't bail, he was on a suspended sentence. He
Oh.
was on conditions from the court.
Suspended sentence with conditions.
So of
Does
course,
that change?
you can go back to a court and ask for a variation, but obviously that's it's a process.
Thank
But
you
I
for
think,
clarifying.
also many of the rehabilitation centres have their own rules about granting leave, and that would not require an amendment to the conditions from the court.
Or perhaps the use of standard terms of orders which do allow that flexibility might be a reform that might be appropriate, but
I think, however, that in this case, I might be wrong, it was to do with the requirements of CAPU in relation to when people are allowed to return, particularly in relation to the way we left.
well, I withdraw that question then, Coroner. Yeah, the coroner's heard about police needing guns to perform their duties safely. Are there other alternatives that haven't been considered? I mean, open carry of guns.
So exposed firearms is one thing. An ability to access a firearm that's not exposed is another. CIB and detectives have firearms available to them, but they're usually held on an ankle holster or a shoulder holster, so you still have access to weaponry if you need to under the circumstances that could change in an instant.
Do you see that as an alternative to open carry of guns in community?
There's opportunities for discussion there, but I understand that's not something that has had discussion.
I just want to take up some numbers that Dr. Freckleton gave you. By my calculation, the figures that Dr. Freckleton gave include emergency service staff, and he stated that there were actually 91 constables and 50 ACLOs, so that is a total of about 141, which is probably closer to 5.7% than 11.4%.
But there's a lot of other Aboriginal people employed in different positions.
Yes, but they're not serving police officers.
They're not sworn.
Yes, they're not sworn. So the number of sworn is probably closer to about half the figure that you gave. Can you just explain 91 constables and 50 ACLOs?
The figures that were referred to are in paragraph 100 of the third statement of the Deputy Commissioner, and that was, as I said, across the full police and fire emergency services, reaching the 11.41% figure. In paragraph 101, what's referred to are sworn members, including 10 sergeants and senior sergeants, 91 constables, recruits, auxiliaries, ACPOs and ACPO recruits, all of whom are sworn members, 183 of those.
Right. Thank you for clarifying that. I wonder then, Ms. Little, whether you have any other comments that you'd like to make about your statement or the recommendations that you made to Coroner today.
I think I've been very clear in the recommendations that I'd like to see. I think this is an opportunity for honesty and to reset where we're heading and rebuild relationships with Aboriginal people. And I see the AJA as one part of many pieces to fulfil that role, an important part. I think everyone has a role to play in making sure that communities function well, from teachers and more. I think that there are a lot of agencies and operators that work in Aboriginal communities that can do better, and Aboriginal people in there have been so gracious and polite in the way that they have told us how that needs to change. And we need to respect that process and actually take on board and listen to what people want to do.
And finally, my last question, is there anything else you'd like to say to John Walker's family or the people of New England?
I want to thank the Yundumi community for allowing us to do the consultations and the surrounding related communities and homelands. I'm sorry for their loss in these circumstances.
Thank you.
Nothing more, I think, thank you.
Ms Little, thank you so much for the great care and consideration that has gone into your statement, and in particular your suggested recommendations are definitely something that we will reflect on very deeply, and I'm sure that the parties, in particular the police and health, will also reflect deeply on those recommendations. They provide significant insight, and we appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll adjourn for lunch.
Julian.